Because our congregational building is situated in Florida, and Florida is a place where lots of people move, many of you aren't originally from here and have moved. Some of you at home have probably moved as well. Perhaps you've had the blessing of having professional movers move you, which sometimes also comes with the curse of having to deal with the insurance company when they broke stuff and all the rest of the things that go. I think my wife and I have moved 7, 8 times. 2 of those were professional movers. The rest we did ourselves. And whenever you're moving yourself, you find out that packing is important, because you never want to show up to help somebody move and find out that they haven't done all that yet. But then the help that shows up, you need, right? Because some things need more than one person to carry. And I remember actually our first move that we did ourselves. We were moving out of our house into storage because our house before we went to seminary sold more quickly than we thought it would, and so we just needed a little bit of in-between time. And one of the people that showed up to help was taking whole dollies of boxes, right? Just working hard. It's hot outside, dragging up a dolly of boxes up the ramp on the truck, putting them on the truck, going back, getting another load. And another friend of mine would walk up with a lamp. That was it, just a lamp. And then, right, the one would come with a whole load of boxes, and the other would come back with a pillow or whatever, right? Like all these little things. And there was no reason they couldn't carry more. They just weren't working as hard as the other one. And guess what the other one said at some point? Why is he even here? Now, we do this. I invite you right now to just take a moment. I'm guessing almost all of us, probably all of us, have a time where we can remember where we're looking at somebody else's efforts and wondering, why are they even here? Do you have one? That didn't take long. Okay. Now, I had a job before that where you didn't have to worry so much about what other people were doing. You had to keep up. It was an intense environment. You didn't show up on a day and think, gosh, are they going to do their work today? It was, if I don't get my work done, this isn't going to be good. We had unlimited sick days. You could take as many sick days as you wanted. No one ever took sick days, because that meant you fell behind and couldn't keep up. So, you know, in an environment like that, you're maybe not judging everybody else's work the way it happened when we were moving, but you still did. Because there was one guy I remember who I would say put on a good show. He would float around the office, patting every manager on the back, you know, made up nicknames for people, had all these ways he connected, always looked busy, always had a whiteboard next to his desk that looked like it had a lot of work on it. But if you really paid attention, you weren't really sure how much he was actually getting done. But he got a lot of credit for the other things, right? So he was putting on a good show. You ever know anybody that put on a good show? You got that person in mind? Now, here's the thing. On that same project, even though we were just trying to keep up, you still at some point go, he's putting on a good show, well, I'm over here making this thing work. And I worked for, my manager had 2 teams, and the one team needed a lot of help. So I, at some point, was doing most of her job and my job. And that was how you got promoted, by the way. That's how you kept up. And they decided they were going to separate her 2 teams. And I was like, this is awesome. I'm about to get promoted. I'm going to have this whole team to myself. We're going to keep doing the work we're doing. And then I got called into her boss's office, who then said, we're separating these 2 teams. And I was like, yep. And he said, and we've hired somebody to come in and run your team. And what really made it worse was she had just quit our company because she didn't think there was a project anywhere, and they hired her back in to be my supervisor. She said, she's got way more experience than you do, which in years-wise wasn't true. Eventually, I came to figure out she did know a lot more about what we were doing, right? They did the right thing, but I was really caught up in my sense of how good I was doing, right? So at the same time as we could look and say, he's putting on a good show, I'm over here thinking pretty good of myself along the way. Have you ever run into that? Where your sense of you wasn't the same as everybody else's? Maybe not. So all of this is a precursor to say, as we enter into today's letter from the Galatians, Paul has some stuff to say about how we think about ourselves, how we relate to other people, and how we relate to God. And to unpack that, I actually want to use a symbol that we see all the time. If you flip over a plastic container, what are you going to see on the bottom of it? Recycle, right? There's 3 little arrows, and they stand for 3 R's. The first is reduce, reuse, recycle, right? There's that little symbol, and there's an order to that. The first thing, if we're going to care for our creation, is to reduce how much packaging that we are using. The second thing is, if you can't reduce it, like milk has to come in packaging. If you're going to drink milk, it's got to come in something, right? If you can't reduce it, then reuse it. So take that thing that you have now procured and use it for a different purpose. But if you can't reduce it and you can't reuse it, then you recycle it, right? Where it gets turned into something altogether different. And so you'll find boxes that say this is made from 100% recycled material. You don't know what it used to be, but now it's a box. Reduce, reuse, recycle. I'm going to change one of the words as we reflect on Galatians, though. We're going to say reduce, restore, recycle. Because Paul talks about all of these things in the 6th chapter of Galatians. We'll start in the same place. Reduce. Paul tells us some things that we can reduce. The first verse of the chapter says that those of you who have been gifted with the Spirit should restore, we'll get to restoration fully in a minute, should restore them with a spirit of gentleness. Why is Paul telling the Galatians that? He's not just sitting around assuming they're being gentle and maybe reminding them. Paul's writing to the Galatians because they probably have not been gentle with one another. They've probably been quite judgmental with one another. And he's heard these things probably in the same way we hear them, which is somebody showed up and said, Paul, I don't know why he's even here. Right? So he's writing them a letter to remind them some stuff that they're maybe not living into. So the first thing he's saying is, knock off whatever mean-spiritedness you have and live with a spirit of gentleness. But then he continues to go on and says, don't be tempted. Right? Reduce your temptation. Now, I did this on purpose. I've already tempted you today to think about other people in a poor light for their work efforts. And you went right there with me. Right? I said, can you think of it? You said, yep. What about somebody that you said, yep, right? So reduce your temptation, Paul says, right? So reduce your mean-spiritedness, probably. Reduce your temptation. Then he says, bear one another's burdens, which is an addition. But he says, mind your own work, right? Don't compare your work to the work of others. So don't be judging others, yourself, especially based on others. So reduce your comparing yourself to other people. And then when he says bear one another's burdens, he says make sure you carry your own load. Now there's a little bit of a paradox here. We're called to carry and bear one another's burdens. And then he says, except for you should carry your own burden. And you say, well, how's that supposed to work? We're either sharing in these burdens or we're not. I think what Paul is saying is don't be a consumer, right? Don't be someone who just eats up everybody else's help and energy. Don't just be needy all the time. There's a bearing of burdens. Do the best you can to carry your burden and share others' burdens as you go along. But reduce your, need to be constantly consuming other people's energy. And then, so far we've reduced our temptation, we've reduced our mean-spiritedness, we've reduced our complaining to other people, we've reduced our need to be needy all the time. And then he says, and by the way, don't go put on a show of faithfulness. So we need to reduce our showiness about how we be faithful in the world. That's a pretty thorough covering of reducing, right? All of this is how we relate to ourselves, right? So when you think about that recycle symbol, it goes in a circle. The first part of this is thinking about who we are. Now, I don't think Paul is inviting us to just wallow in self-pity. I think what he's inviting us to is what I would call action and reflection. Whenever we've had interns, the entire model of internship that we have as Lutherans is that you spend a year in action and reflection. So I spend a couple hours every week in conversation with the intern, where I always ask what my internship supervisor asked me, which is, what'd you learn about being a pastor this week? And then we talk about some kind of action or situation, and then, what did you learn? And that what did you learn is very much an internal thing, right? How did I respond to that? How did I enter into that? What did I do? Not, why is that person even here, right? What's their work, right? It's all about our work, right? So I think what Paul is saying in all of this reducing is to invite us into some action and reflection about how we live as human beings. Because the next step is restoration. The very first bit of the passage says, if someone is found to be in a transgression. So it's not that there's not some kind of discerning that people are missing the mark in the way they're living. It's that we don't measure ourselves against that and come at that with the mean-spiritedness. What he's saying is, when that happens, restore them with the spirit of gentleness. Well, I think Paul would say that we can't restore people with the spirit of gentleness if we're not doing some of our own reflection about how we live in the world so that we can come at that with a little bit of our own peace and wholeness, right? Also, bearing one another's burdens. That's about restoration. It's about walking with each other in those places of struggle and suffering and brokenness as we all head towards that restoration that God provides. So we reduce, we restore. What's the last one? Recycle. If you pay attention to this passage, the very first thing Paul says is, those who have received the gift of the Spirit. So from the beginning, the Spirit is a gift. We're not doing any of this reducing or any of this restoring without the gift of the Spirit guiding us. But then he comes around later, and he's kind of amped up that there's people who are making a show of faith and expecting others to be faithful when they're maybe not even being that faithful. And he says, listen, the only thing that I boast in is the cross. He says, the world has been crucified to me, and I have been crucified to the world. I think what Paul is saying is that suffering is where Jesus meets us, but also suffering is where we see God most clearly. If you think about all of the giftedness we have as humans, do we all have the same gifts? No, right? Some people are super creative. Some people are super analytical. Some people have a gift for conversation and care. Some people have gifts for order, and there's so many gifts, and sometimes it can be hard to relate on that level of gifts. The place, though, where we probably relate much more easily is in our places of brokenness, in our places of suffering. Not that everybody's grief after death is the same, or everybody's experience of an illness is the same, but the suffering, right, that is where we could be connected as people. So when Paul says, I only boast in the cross, the world has been crucified to me and I to the world, I think he's saying that God meets us in that place of suffering, and that if we're going to reduce and restore, it's going to come from suffering, not from some place of success or anything else. So how is it that we then enter into that reducing and that work of restoring one another? Well, first we have to be recycled. And where do we get recycled? Water's baptism, right? We die and get made new. Now, do any of us look completely different than yesterday? No, right? We're the same bodies, but right, the idea that baptism makes us new is an ongoing process where we are constantly being made new into something completely different, even if we look a lot the same. So instead of starting with reduce, restore, recycle, we actually start with recycle. The recycling that we have in the death and resurrection of Jesus is what equips us to do that work on ourselves, which really is about dwelling on our own suffering. Because if I dwell on my own suffering, and then I encounter somebody that I might otherwise have difficulty with, guess what? They're suffering too. And when I find that connection to my suffering to their suffering, now there's an opportunity for compassion, mercy, love, peace, even if I disagree with them about everything in the world. So that the recycling comes first, our reducing, right, our sitting into our own suffering comes next, and then that restoration comes, and we can do that with the gentleness of spirit, not because we're so gentle, but because we're so broken, and it's in those connections of brokenness that we can do that. Now, the other thing about that recycle symbol is there's a number in the center of it, right? How many do you know? So can you recycle number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? Nope, right? That just makes more work for the recycle people, which we don't want to do. So there's a limit to what can be recycled. And as a human being who is trying to reduce comparing myself to others and trying to reduce being showy and thinking too much of myself, I still want to put a limit on what numbers go in the middle of that thing when it comes to people. Particularly people who I think are not doing what Paul is telling us to do. There are those whose sense of Christianity would say that I can't do all the weddings that I want to do because they don't think I should be marrying people of the same gender. They don't think that that is faithful. And rather than reduce and tend to their own things, they would have their faith imposed on my faith, right? And I think that's where Paul's saying, knock all of that off, tend to yourself, and work towards restoration. And the hard part for me is, I said this a few weeks ago too, I don't know if I want unity of the church, if it means I have to be in unity with certain parts of the church. And today, I don't know if I want to restore people with the spirit of gentleness if I can't get on the same page with them theologically. But then I think about that recycle symbol. And if Jesus is the one doing the recycling, what's in the middle of that symbol? Cross. Today it'd be the cross because Paul is talking about the cross. If we could figure out how to draw a good empty tomb, that might be there too. But the cross, right? Those little 3 arrows with a cross at the middle that reminds us that God recreates and makes new each and every one of us over and over and over again without doubt or question. And it's that recreation and that recycling. Paul says it in this passage, a new creation is everything. And it's that new creation that allows us to turn in on ourselves, not to wallow in ourselves and not to just sit around and focus on the brokenness, but to see that as a way into restoration. Now, as a pastor, this is one of my things I like to do with metaphors. My hope now is that every single time you pick up a piece of consumer packaging and go, can I recycle this? That you see those little arrows and go, I have been baptized into a new creation. And because of that, Jesus is restoring me and has given me the gifts to think about that, and in thinking and reflecting on that, can go out into the world with the spirit of gentleness and to restore others. I hope that sticks with all of us, that every time we see those 3 little arrows, we think, first, reduce, reuse, recycle so we can take good care of our creation. And second, reduce, restore, actually recycle, reduce, restore, and live into the fullness of that gift of grace. Amen.